Our next speaker is Christoph Trebesch from the Institute for the World Economy in Kiel. I'm very happy to have you here. You've worked a lot on sovereign debt, on international financial markets. You did your PhD in Berlin, then you went to Munich, and since then I think you went straight to Kiel. And you already have a fantastic track record, including presence in the media and news articles. So I think we have a lot to learn, so I'm looking forward to your talk.
First of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation, for the introduction, and for allowing us to present our work, which is together with Sebastian Horn, who's actually now he's still at the Kiel Institute, but moved to the World Bank, and Carmen Reinhardt, who will leave the World Bank this month and go back to Harvard. Which is why, I would like to emphasize that all views are personal and don't represent the views of the institutions we are working at. This is part of a larger research agenda on official finance. And so this paper focuses on official international lending, which is lending between two governments of independent nations, between two central banks, or between an international organization like the IMF or the World Bank, and a sovereign debtor country. So this is in a way different from my traditional work and in fact the work of much of my colleagues in this field. So when we think about government debt, we think about a government raising capital in raising money in the capital markets, issuing sovereign bonds, maybe going to a syndicate of banks, and then there's this myriad of work, of papers looking at the drivers of pricing, debt accumulation issues, and what goes wrong, what happens when the relationship between those private creditors and the sovereign goes sour, so sovereign defaults and restructurings, etc. This paper focuses on this other universe of government-to-government lending, which is as we will show in this paper, a large universe and a very unexplored one. And one motivation to go down this route to study official finance is that we are seeing that the role of the government as creditor, or the role of official actors as creditors, is growing. To some degree, we're going back to the 1950s when official finance, government-driven financing across borders was the only game in town, right? What we are seeing is that during the Eurozone crisis, there were record bailouts by governments. We've seen the same during the Corona crisis. We see that central banks that are official actors now hold large chunks of government debt. And we are seeing a new type of creditor, the emerging creditor nations. We spoke about China, right? But also Arab countries, countries like India, that when they go abroad, when they lend and invest abroad, they're much more likely to use state vehicles, state banks, state investment funds. So wherever you look, you're seeing kind of a return of official actors and official creditors becoming more important around the world, and therefore we think this is very important arena to study. And again, there has not been a lot of work on this in the recent decades. In particular, what we do in this paper is to focus on international lending during disasters. So disasters, we focus on financial crisis, major wars, and major natural catastrophes. So we're interested in the international financial response to these major disasters. So how do governments assist each other with these lending relationships during disasters? And therefore I should mention that, or a little advertisement on the side project. We created, not with Carmen and Sebastian, but at the Kiel Institute, this Ukraine support tracker, for tracking the financial support, but also the military and humanitarian support of nations to Ukraine. So this was a spin-off of this project, and we also have a China-specific paper. So when you ask yourself how does China fit in the picture, there's this whole separate agenda on China. So this has been kind of the part of a bigger agenda, and it's kind of the the central paper of this agenda. So let me start by showing you one central graph that is not in the paper. This is most of what I'm going to talk about are flows, government-to-government lending flows. What we've also done now in this revision, this has been many years in the making, this project. What we've now managed to do is to separate debt stocks, external debt of all countries in the world, into the private component, so that lent by banks and bondholders, as well as bilateral and multilateral debt. So these are the official, like multilateral. Think of IMF, World Bank, African Development Bank, etc. Bilateral is government to government. Okay, and what you can see is that over the past 100 years, these official debt stocks, this is weighted by GDP, so this is not biased by the Afghanistans and Zimbabwe's of the world. It's really this is the external debt universe. The debt stock, this is not domestic, right? That's important. It's not Eurozone debt will not be in there, but external debt stocks. So think of a lot of emerging markets, but also when rich countries go abroad and borrow. And in this universe, official debt has had a weight of 50%. But the literature, including my own work in the past 10 years, very much focused only on this part, right? So this is what kind of motivated the knowledge that this is an important part of the universe. We knew that ex ante, but how important it was, when we finished this graph was very much a surprise as well. So from this graph, there's two fundamental questions that arise. Why does this market even exist? Why would a government lend to another government, right? Why not do it via the market? There's all these political problems associated to it. So why it's a highly concessional market, as I will show. So why go the effort? Why take the effort? And who lends to whom? So where are those kind of lending networks? Who's giving what and when? And the second question, how do official and private lending flows relate? We know much more on these private parts of the international capital market. So how does official fit in? How is the relationship both in terms of flows and in terms of interest rates? So how are these two markets comparable in terms of basic characteristics? Okay. So these are kind of the two guiding questions that I will go through in the following slides. Just as a quick summary, right? I will not go in detail in the literature, but basically there's very little work on official flows. If it exists, it has a narrow focus on say the last 20, 30 years, or individual episodes or individual countries. So this is the core contribution here is really that we are the first. This is the first analysis presenting an encompassing data set. And analysis of official international lending over the past 200 years. So it takes a big picture to understand this market. What do we mean by official international debt? Well, let me be very precise. We consider loans, grants, and guarantees by governments, multilateral institutions, and central banks across borders. Right, so we would include a Chinese bank lending to Zimbabwe. That would be in there. We use a variety of sources. So this is really a consensus database patched together from hundreds of different sources, trying to consolidate and compare. So get as much information on every single transaction as possible and compare across sources and consolidate that. We use kind of standard data sources, World Bank and OECD data sets, but then we also use annual reports, budget accounts, and more obscure sources. For example, international treaties. We benefit from the fact that diplomacy became more formalized in the 19th century, right? So whenever one state would give a credit to another state, there would be a treaty. We can look for these treaties in these archives that have been created by historians, and then you code the characteristics of those loans. Much of what it will show is very aggregate. Right? These are aggregate time series, but the data set itself is actually a micro-level data set. So we cover overall 230,000 grants and loans by more than 100 governments and more than 50 international institutions. And just to give you a sense, overall we trace 15 trillion real US dollar inflows. That's about the size of the US bond market in 2010. right? So this is the ballpark number. Who lends? So who are the creditors we're tracing? So traditionally it was all bilateral creditors. Treasuries, foreign and colonial offices, you have the development ministries and export credit banks. After World War I, you see the rise of these multilateral creditors, starting with the League of Nations guarantees. You see the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and increasingly regional development bank and regional safety nets. Just examples on sources. So these are kind of these historical budget accounts that you can have both on the debtor and the creditor side. This is from Great Britain and shows the outstanding debt to, say, Sardinia, Portugal, Russia, etc. And then we can trace these across years and compare across sources. For the post World War II era, we knew that the Soviet Union was a very active lender, competing with the US in ways similar we're seeing now with Belt and Road versus Build Back Better world. So repeat of history there as well. When we started the project, we had no idea how to take those, how to identify those Soviet lending activities. And it turns out that the CIA meticulously traced each and every loan by the Soviets in a wonderful overview that was kind of released, I think, 7 years ago, was declassified. So we used these CIA reports to actually construct the post-World War II lending data set for the Sino-Soviet bloc. That was a very important part. So what are the key takeaways? The first question, how large is this, right? This is relevant. This is like a sideshow of IMF and World Bank lending. No, it's not. This is a large, quantitatively large markets, especially during disasters, so financial crisis, wars, and natural disasters. It's a much older history than the IMF and the World Bank. There's a lot of work on the IMF and the World Bank, but in a way, one way to see this paper is that this is a 200-year history with different colors, and the IMF and the World Bank are just a new kind of institutional form of a much older story. What's interesting is that we find that official international lending is much more institutionalized today. So lending was much more spiky and ad hoc in the 19th century. Today, it's very much standard that you see large-scale international lending in disaster situations, right? So it's become, in a way, Carmen likes to say we've seen a globalization of altruism, right? That's one interpretation, to be a bit provocative here, but we had the first era of globalization, right, until World War I, large-scale trade and private finance, but much less official government-to-government assistance. Now we have, in the second wave of global financial and trade globalization, we see this official government-to-government lending universe being much more institutional, much larger, and that's quite fascinating to see. What happened between those two eras is an open question, but we certainly document that for the first time. We find that official flows differ markedly from private flows, so you will not be surprised that official lending is highly concessional. We document that, but that's not true only for the World Bank and the IMF loans, but more generally, and it's had become more concessional over time. So official lending has low interest rates and longer maturities, which again raises the question, why would you ever do that? Like, why do you give out loans to a risky government with long maturities and low interest rates? Why do governments do that? And we find inverse dynamics. So when private flows retrench, official lending often steps in, right? Which again speaks to the relevance of this for risk sharing and exactly those disaster situations. So official flows tend to be counter-cyclical, while we know very well from the international finance literature that private flows are pro-cyclical. So this is a very different type of flow. And then the question, why does it actually exist? Well, we give a partial answer. We had this discussion yesterday, right? We're not answering this question in full for sure. But one answer is to follow kind of this Tirol paper and Gorinchas et al. Argument that basically what drives rescue lending between countries is the desire to protect your own banks and your own traders, right? So when your neighbor goes under and you have a close linkage is economic, you have an interest to save that neighbor in your own proper interest, right? And that's what we also confirm. So bailouts increase with economic exposure. Whether, again, that's a selfish motive or just, kind of helping your friends and neighbors is another issue. Let me get to, a central graph of the paper. This is the total flows aggregated across the world of international lending flows, and the blue is bilateral and the red is multilateral. From 1790, so we're starting before the Napoleonic Wars, until 2015. And what you can see is what I said before. You have this very spiky, so official lending goes back a long time, but it's much more spiky in history. What you also can see, of course, is like how disruptive, we had this discussion yesterday, how disruptive wars are for the international financial system. You see that during World War I and World War II, I should say that we scale the size of total flows by center country GDP. So this is as a share of British GDP until 1914, and as a share of US GDP from then on. We don't use world GDP because that's a much noisier measure in history, but it looks similar. So US and UK GDP, there's a whole industry estimating these historically, so it's a cleaner measure, but it looks similar. So to make this point, during World War I and World War II, what you see is that in a single year, you would see 10% of US GDP being transferred versus via official lending, right? That's 2,000 billion US dollars in today's terms in a single year. And put that in perspective to the 750 next generation EU funds, right, which we have much talked about, the Corona 750 stretched over, 15, 20 years. Here we have, in one single year, 2,000 billion in lending relationships. So that shows how disruptive wars are. In fact, those spikes are even, again, that was surprising to me. I had the impression that the crisis years of the 2008 to 2012, those were record-breaking bailouts. But if you compare it to history, they pale in total size. What you can see is that the reason the literature very much focuses on the IMF and the World Bank is that it has become indeed very important since the 1980s. In fact, the IMF and the World Bank account for about half of official lending since then, and have, of course, played a decisive role in the financial crisis as well. And as you can see, no longer spiky, but very much institutionalized, with about 2% of US GDP being sent every single year. This is a breakdown of, what is this used for? Well, money is fungible, so this is, is to be treated with care, but nevertheless, we do this rough classification, and given the Ukraine war, I pulled this out of the appendix and integrated in the main paper, because it's just interesting to see how these military, times of war, how much of the lending is actually due to military purposes, which is the green shaded area, and financial crisis, the red shaded area, also play a decisive role. But wars are really often a trigger of this government-to-government lending. This is to re-emphasize, that we are not talking only about IMF and World Bank. Bilateral has been dominant, over much of history. Now, what is important, and again, very unexplored, are all these regional lending schemes. So we know very little about those as well. So we have more and more regional schemes. Now we see the same plans to also have an African kind of monetary fund. So all these regions are creating new kind of vehicles for emergency lending, and that's, I think, a field where the literature should move into, because very little understood. Why do we see all these regional schemes, and how do they work in comparison to the other? You can trace, kind of the rise and fall of great powers also in the lending amounts. So if you go back to 1900, Western Europe used to dominate Great Britain, France, Germany. You then see the rise of the United States, which becomes very, very dominant after World War II. Russia then catches up and engages in large-scale lending to developing countries. You have the OPEC country with a brief blip being main creditor nations during the flush years of the 70s, with oil prices going through the roof. And then you see basically the rise of South-South lending, the rise of China, essentially. So these are emerging markets becoming more important creditors in this universe. And this is, as we had discussed the other day, this is not going away. This is only the beginning of a new kind of time where you see emerging markets becoming more important as creditors. We also, I mentioned this, trace central bank to central bank lending. For modern times, we focus on swap lines, which of course somewhat different from classic lending arrangements, but still they are the modern type support measure between central banks. And what you can see is that once you combine the scale of swap line lending overnight and collateralized with those traditional loans between central banks, for example, in the Great Depression, you see that those are similar in size. 3% of US GDP was given out between central banks during the interwar years when we know Germany, Austria, Britain saw bank runs, and France and other countries tried to support those other central banks, eventually to no avail because the interwar gold standard did collapse. But you see that there's a lot of central bank to central bank lending, and this has in a way returned as well. Also during Corona, we've seen record swap line liquidity exposure during those kind of disasters, right? So disasters also trigger central bank to central bank lending. Once we add that, the picture to the previous picture, so the gray shaded areas are official loans, what I've shown you before, plus the central bank, then nothing much changes besides the 1930s. So what is fascinating is that we didn't have, during the disaster of the Great Depression, you didn't have much government-to-government lending. Only the central banks reacted, not sufficiently, as it showed. But that's actually an interesting instance of missing or non-existing international support, despite one of the most dramatic economic crises in the world. That's quite interesting. So here you see the spike in central bank lending, and then of course 2008. But the overall picture is really dominated by government to government. Let me go to the comparison of private and official flows. So this is, again, not in the paper, I'm sorry, but it's not changing the overall picture much. But what we did in the last 2 years is to trace interest rates. This was very painful to understand the historical terms of those loans. And what you can see is that this is about 100 years of data. It has always been a concessional market, right? So interest rates have all been below 5%. If we compare those to a safe asset, the U.S. government yield, you see that the spread is close to zero, and in fact turns negative from the 1960s on. So we see basically these are highly concessional, highly subsidized lending relationships. Okay, and that's even more so if you account for risk premium. This is just even compared just to a safe asset. When you see, for those years for which we have ratings, we see the lower the rating, so the higher the risk, the higher the interest rate that you have to pay on sovereign bonds, right? That's pretty standard. But that's not at all the case for bilateral, multilateral lending. If anything, it goes down, right? So the riskier you are, it doesn't react. There's no sensitivity in terms of the interest rate charged by other governments or by other multilaterals. And the same is, pattern you can see for maturities. Riskier countries are on a shorter leash in the private markets. That's not true for the official markets. If anything, it goes up. So when you lend to riskier countries, you give longer credit, maturities. Let's go to the dynamics at play. So the gray bars again show you official lending, government to government. What is new in this graph is the red line. The red line comes from a separate paper for Vincent and Carmen Reinhardt and myself, where we tried to trace international private capital flows back 200 years. And it's a bit of a, we mix gross flows until World War I with net flows from then onwards. So it's not a perfect time series, but it gives you an idea of the overall relationship between private flows, the red line, and the gray shaded arrows of official lending flows. What you can see is then what I said before, right? When private markets, when private flows subside, when there's a sudden stop, you see a sudden spike in official lending. That's true for the wars, that's true for episodes like the Bering crisis, that's true for the mother of all sudden stop that has been, Eichengreen has been working on in the 1930s, early 1930s. And it's true for a variety of post-World War II crises, and of course also for the 2008 crisis. The overall correlation is minus 0.36. So again, there's an inverse relationship between those flows. And of course, to tighten that a bit up, we have a couple of case studies that where we, again, not in the paper, sorry for that, but again, it's not changing the overall picture. This is interwar and Great Depression. This is the red line, was easy to collect. It's the well-known boom of the 1920s, the roaring 20s, where the US financed Europe. What is new are these bars. This is from our data, and there was much more post-World War II, World War I lending than we knew. As when private markets crashed, you see this rise of central bank lending. So there's indeed an inverse relationship between the two in this era. This is just billions of dollars. It's also true in the Asian crisis. For the interest of time, I will skip through these quickly. And it's also true during the Eurozone crisis, where when the private debt boom ended, you saw these record amounts of official lending. Finally, Corona. These are monthly data. The red line was very easy to get. These are private international capital flows as proxied by the IIF. Think of these as portfolio holdings of debt and equity, collapsing at the start of Corona, and then the IMF, regional, and World Bank lending going up, and just constructing that took us a couple of weeks because there is just no standardized data set on these official flows. So when you have to trace these regional banks, you have to go to each and every of those institutions and collect the data, right? So again, we see the sudden spike in official lending and a sudden stop in private international capital flows. And that's true for various episodes of history. Why do countries extend rescue loans, or who gets what and why? So our motivation is to zoom into kind of this Tyrol, or to build on the Tyrol idea that during major disasters you will bail out those countries that are closely intertwined with yourself, and we focus on financial crisis, wars and military conflict. From financial crisis, standard Reinhard and Rogoff data set updated in our recent work, and then you have wars and military conflict, where the Correlates of War project provides all the data we need. For natural catastrophes, it was messier. So some of you might know the MDAT data set, but that goes only until 1900. So we needed to basically construct a whole new data set on natural disasters in the 19th century. Focusing on the major ones using a variety of historical country studies. That's all in the appendix. I'm not going to bore you with it, but that's another feature of the paper, that we kind of classify these disasters in a systematic way over 200 years as well. To motivate this, again, the institutionalization. So what's the response to a major natural disaster, right? The cutoff is here that you have significant damage, significant death in the population. And then this is the simple probability of receiving an international loan from another government. So think of in a major natural disasters by era, right? In the long 19th century, the probability was a mere 10%, right? You had these major famines, say in Persia in the 1890s, millions of the population died, and they didn't receive a single penny from outside. Today, you have cases like Haiti and now Ukraine, where you have lending exceeding 100% of GDP, right? And you see the probability of seeing rescue loans in natural disasters has gone up to 100%. So it becomes standard to see official support in major disasters like wars and financial crisis. And this is what I mean by institutionalization. It has become an integral part of the international system. Now we exploit the dyadic data that we constructed over the 200-year period to get closer to the question of why those kind of lending flows happen. We estimate a standard PPML gravity model where the dependent variables are rescue loans of creditor country J to crisis country I in disaster episode T, and we regress that on proxies for economic exposure, in particular bilateral trade shares, but also bilateral financial exposure using the BIS data, the bilateral BIS data, which is available from the 1980s. We control for political ties, and then the standard gravity controls that everybody uses. This is kind of a selected sample because we only focus on disaster episodes. This will be expanded heavily in the next revision, where we will have a full panel with interaction terms and all that. So this is in a way preliminary, but it tells the story that ultimately we will also tell in the more advanced regression setting. Just to give you a sense of the overall pattern, so every dot here is a bailout in a crisis situation, and the higher the dot, the larger the bailout is, right? And what you can see is the closer two countries are in terms of their bilateral trade shares, the higher the amount of lending that flows, and the same is true if we use bank exposure, so bilateral bank linkages instead of trade, right? So there's a positive relationship between being economically exposed and seeing bailouts in crisis situations, right? So dependent variable here is bilateral rescue lending amounts, okay, and this is regressed on bilateral trade exposure and bilateral financial exposure. What you can see is that throughout the 200-year period, including sub-periods, we see a significant link between the two. So 1% higher trade exposure is associated with 0.34% more official lending, and the same is true if we focus on financial exposure. The other variables are very much in line, so distance is negative, so the farther you're away, the less lendings you see. The closer you are in terms of UN voting, right, so as a proxy for political alignment, if you're closely aligned politically, you also see more bailouts, more rescue lending in crisis, former colonies, as well as fixed effects and all that, right? But the key takeaway is really the closer two countries are, the heavier the official lending is during disaster situations. So let me conclude. Official lending is much larger than previously known. This is a sizable market, a little understood market that is highly concessional. And of course, the next step in this agenda will be to understand the drivers of this, including geopolitical drivers of this, because we're back in kind of that era where geopolitical questions become front and center. And they have, you look back at why those loans were given out historically, and it's very clear these are often geopolitically motivated, and there's much to do to explore those linkages. But also there's much to do in terms of the macro implications. So what does that mean for the risk-sharing literature, for the literature on shocks and international lending? This kind of market has long been ignored. At most, you would have a control for IMF, but we hope we have shown that this is really an integral part, so deserves much more further study. Thank you so much.
Thanks. So we have two discussants. First is Lars Feld himself. So the question is, we all know him, but maybe I should still say that he's a very prominent figure in academia, in politics, and in the public discourse. So, and interesting, I mean, you have many commissions, also by the government, minimum wage commission. I just found that you and Christoph are in the same council, advisory council for the federal ministry, is that right?
It's true, yes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of commissions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I promised Christoph to be very critical on his paper. Let's try to see how true this is actually. First of all, let me start with a personal note. In April 2019, I was invited to give a talk at the University of Zurich, these famous series organized by the Swiss Institute of External Affairs. I had first a look at the traditional GDP projections across time. The idea was to have a look at crises of the future. So they wanted to know, well, from a political point of view, what could be the next that's coming up. And my second step was to look at the financial crisis, look back directly to the financial crisis and ask what might be the problems in that regard coming up in the coming years. My third step was saying, first of all, we cannot say what the source of the next crisis is going to be. We must be very careful in telling the general public that anyone knows what the next crisis could be. And to some extent, COVID has been an example that proved this cautiousness to be considerably well taken. And then I took a step back and asked what are the main drivers of wealth destruction. And looking at that, you quickly realize that it's mainly wars. War is the most important form of destroying wealth of a country. And then I made this outlook on climate change and so on, the challenges that we all are aware of, and I could also say, well, we have political solutions to that. Perhaps not knowing all the details, but at least we are, as economists, pretty aware how to cope with these issues. Yeah? We have one challenge, and I conclude that we have one challenge, and I thought of China. We economists do not have solutions for, and these are international armed conflicts. I was not thinking about Russia at this point in time. From an economic point of view, what Russia is doing is looking quite irrational. When you look at in economic terms, a medium-sized economy trying something like this, it's quite difficult to sustain the position in the future. And this is what you see here. The graph is in German, but it's actually written down there what it is. It is the development of German real GDP per capita since 1870, so similar to your analysis, but only for one country and not so much earlier. And what you see are here refers to the First World War, World War I, World War II, hyperinflation, and the Great Depression. These are the periods that destroyed considerable wealth in Germany. In particular, the world wars are something like that. You could also say the hyperinflation is a fallout of the First World War, so you can take both together. Look at the Great Recession, which is only a blip in this development as compared to the wars that we had before. Yeah? And so I don't tell you this just to make some marketing on my own work, but I think this is resonating pretty well of what Christoph and Carmen and the co-author, what they are saying, that wars are very important. When you look at it from the lending side, you see it's a similar picture. Yeah. But the difference, of course, is that they are, I only had a small idea to present something on top, but this is a very sound and comprehensive analysis looking at what's going on. So what they are doing is an enormous body of work that you only saw a small part of it. When you read the paper, there's much more in it, and Christoph presented even additional analyses from which you could start given this data set. Only the descriptive analyses are already very interesting to see what is in this data across time. And then what the authors usually do, and this is somehow our professional problem to some extent also, they come up with a more formal analysis to show us something. To some extent it is only showing what's already in the descriptives, and it's also showing that the water is running downhill. It's always fine to see that this happens, that the water actually runs downhill. Yeah? We have also some examples where our colleagues try to convince us that the water is running uphill. Yeah? So therefore it's fine to see this. And I like it very much. What do they find? Actually, in the summary, briefly, they find that financial crises are the most important drivers of official lending in peacetime. But wars are much, much more important than that. Across time, you have an evolution from bilateral to multilateral and institutional lending. That's what you demonstrated in your presentation. You have this negative correlation of official and private lending for private capital flows. Meanwhile, China has become one of the most important official lenders worldwide. And this raises the question, when you look beyond 2015 and more recent developments, the withdrawal of international capital from China, capital outflows that increased considerably, what is this actually meaning in your context? And then the estimation of the gravity model showing that economic financial integration play a role, for example, bilateral trade exposure, political allegiances play a role, and geographical distances. I wondered when I read the paper already, how do you treat this? So actually this is the older graph of what Volker showed us yesterday. These are the bonds held by the Euro system according to the figures of last autumn. So the Netherlands meanwhile is above 45%, Italy is closer to 25% and even at 25% and so on. But what you see here is, well, is this lending or is it monetary policy? How do you treat it in your data set? And in the presentation you also mentioned that to some extent, at least to some extent perhaps, I think you should clarify that. What's going on in your data set regarding Eurozone lending? We have the bilateral lending in the first Greek package, the Greek rescue package that came up in 2010 already. And then you have the ESM and so on. Well, actually it is cross-border because we don't have a federation. And I think if you treat the Eurozone as a whole, this must be clearly coming out of your data set. What are further questions and comments that I have? Well, I could only say I cannot be nasty on your paper. I find it extremely well written, very accessible, very transparent what you are doing. Yeah. The only thing you get is you read the paper and you have additional ideas, what you could do with the data set. And I don't know whether you want to have a stream of paper or write a book about it. Yeah? So I think this is some of the decisions you have to make. So for example, how about sudden stops in your data set? Yeah? You somehow say something on this negative correlation between private and official flows, but I think it's important to have a closer look at that. How is the interaction with fiscal policy in more detail than you can show us in this paper? And then most of you might know that I'm usually looking at government fiscal policies from a political economics point of view. So I think this is one of the most important drivers of fiscal policy overall. And therefore, what you find is actually that political interest, political alignment is there in your paper already, but when we think about the wars, there must be an impact of geostrategic interests. And the geostrategic interests are becoming much, much more important now. We are back in a world that is divided at least into two halves. Yeah? And although quite a lot changed in between, and some countries that were, well, aligning with one or the other half before the fall of the Iron Curtain, now want to resist this. This is what we observe, for example, with respect to India or other countries. But still, the question then is, what does this mean regarding the lending prospects in the future? Yeah? How about this current trend in deglobalization that we observe in this regard? How does it affect financial vulnerability? And when I think again about China, well, how is this? Are these recent developments of deglobalization resonating in data? Is China then replacing what Russia did before and creating its own universe of countries to which it's lending its money? And so, you see, I only find this paper inspiring, and thank you very much.
Second discussant is Kerstin Bernoth from the DIW, the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin. And yeah, she started her career in Bonn with a PhD, then went to the Netherlands Bank as well, central banker as well. And then she's now also heading the macro group there and the graduate education at the DIW is equally present behind and in the public.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Actually, I learned that Christoph has to leave in 15 minutes, so we should hurry up. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you very much to the organizers for having me here and to invite me to this very topical conference. I can congratulate you to have picked this topic 2 years ago already. I very much enjoyed reading Christoph's paper. I can really recommend reading it. You learn a lot on the history of government or official lending. I think the summary, I can skip it almost. I will be very brief. So what is the paper about? The paper actually analyzes why and when do sovereigns lend to each other. And despite the high relevance of this research question, there are much more papers more focusing on why do financial markets lend, or why is private lending happening, not so much why do sovereigns lend to each other. And the main reason why there are not so many papers on the topic is a lack of sufficient data. And so what Christoph and co-authors do is that they fill this gap, so they build an incredible data set. I don't know how many weeks you closed up students in the archives of years to collect this data. And so it's great. So you cover now 200 years of official data. And based on this data set, you provide a very exciting overview over the history of international lending. Broadly speaking, the paper can be divided into 3 parts. So I'm very brief now because of your 15 minutes departure. So the first part is more descriptive, so that you elaborate on the data and give an overview who actually lends to a sovereign. In principle, we have private lending, we have official lending, and you show that these two are negatively correlated. And then you differentiate, when looking at official lending, between bilateral government-to-government lending, multilateral lending, institutions, and central banks. And basically what you find is that previous to the 50s, it was primarily bilateral lending that was most important in financing public debt. And after the 50s, with the creation of the World Bank, IMF, multilateral lending actually became more important. Second part of the paper is that you analyze the relationship between official lending and the occurrence of disasters by merging your new data set with another new data set. So it's also that, also I'm pretty sure quite a lot of work. And what you show is that official international lending after disasters has become much more prevalent and systematic over the past 20 years. So it's good news that we have now much better actually international risk sharing than 200 years ago. And then the final part of the paper, as Lars said, it's basically you try to prove what you see already in the data, is that you estimate a gravity model to confirm the hypothesis that the size of bilateral lending during financial crisis increases in the scale of economic and financial integration. So, general comment, it's a great data set. I'm pretty sure that colleagues will write an email to get access to the data, and that a lot of research will be started on that data set to answer unanswered questions in sovereign debt topics. It's also a very relevant research topic, but, and here's now my first but, I think it's too complex. But you have such a rich data set to cover everything in one paper. So my first suggestion would be to split the paper in 2 parts, because already the descriptive part in the beginning, I think it stands on its own. So it's really interesting to read, but then you start with the empirical exercise in the end, and there I see weaknesses. And until you fix that and you really add further expansions, I think it's like Lars said, a book, because you can write so many papers on it. So I would say, why not splitting? First, so to have one publication only with the great data set that you exploit, and then to continue with the empirical analysis of this data. Why do I think there are weaknesses in the empirical part? And I should not call it weakness, but I think something is missing there. So what is missing is that you don't really take into account so far the interconnectedness of the different type of lenders in the empirical analysis. So you focus on bilateral government-to-government lending and try to answer the question, why do governments lend to governments? And so the main hypothesis you want to test is that countries want to assist other countries in order to avoid spillovers in time of crisis. However, the needs for a country for public assistance also depends on other sources of financing that the country has received. So, but you actually don't take that into account. So it matters whether there's a need for bilateral government-to-government lending, whether the country has still access to financial markets, like Greece during the Euro crisis, or whether other institutions like the IMF and World Bank lend to the country. And the interconnectedness between these different types of official lending, it's not so clear so far in the literature. I think you can exploit that, really. That's why I said I think you can do so much with the data. For example, there are still open questions whether lending from multilateral institutions like the IMF or the World Bank constitute a substitute or complement to government lending. So you cannot put answer on that. It might be that contemporaneous lending from the IMF reduces or increases government-to-government spending, depending on this. That's the whole discussion on catalyst functions of IMF support, for example. Then, and you also show that in your empirical part that there's a negative relationship between private lending and public lending, but you don't take that into account in your estimations. You only look at bilateral lending. So, of course, it's then also one important determinant that you should include in the regression, whether other financing options are used. So what I would say is that it's misleading to analyze one type of official lending separately. Then I think it's one of the big benefits that you have a long data set of 200 years, but it can also be a curse in your case, because what is very likely that also the determinants are have changed over time. So especially in the past 70 years, other financing possibilities have emerged for governments, as you have also shown with the creation of the IMF, with the creation of regional development banks. And so government-to-government financing is only now one option among others. And so that means that the relative attractiveness, why do governments still lend to others or why should I accept a loan that is possibly less favorable? So of course now countries also compare the attractiveness of different financing possibilities, but that's what you said, you collected data now on interest rates, seniority conditions, conditionality, and I would recommend to include that in the regressions as well. And my final comment is more a question to the regression. I wonder whether you have a potential endogeneity problem, because so far you argue that economic integration affects bilateral lending. But it's very likely that the causality also goes the other way around, that countries use lending in order for strategic aspects, like for example now Russia and China, that they are more forward-looking political and strategic motives, like developing future sales market and to get access to natural resources, so that countries lend to countries in emergency in order to become in the future more economically integrated. And so maybe you should somehow consider that possibility. I think it became most relevant also in your picture you showed that Russia, China and other players entered the stage Why is that? That there's suddenly a revival of more government-to-government bonding, despite the fact that we still have IMF, World Bank region. And I think this state rate strategy plays now a much bigger role, so that you have some homogeneity in the repressions. Yeah, but I think it's a great paper, a great data set, and I'm pretty sure that you will have many papers based on that data set in the future. So, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Kerstin. I think, for as long as you have time, and it's best if you respond first to Discussants, and then see how far you can stretch your time constraint. For that, I suppose. Yes, please. Sorry.
Great, thank you very much. So the reason I can be here is that a babysitter is taking care of our three small kids, and I don't want to stretch my lap too far. My wife is also away, so this is the last train you can take without very, very bad conscience. Anyway, so sorry for having to leave. So thanks a lot for the very positive and constructive feedback and criticism. I mean, most of the points are well taken. Let me just go to some of them. How do we treat central bank holdings? Yes, we do have a graph. If you add them, official lending explodes even more, right? If we treat them as those debts as lending relationships, then you see that kind of this phenomenon is even mightier also in terms of historical comparison. We also have the historical in the 2030s, you have massive balance sheets of central banks as well, right? So that's again a return. So yes, it only gets more important. But in this paper, we look at, if you want, core lending relationship with a contract, and so this is not the type of lending we focus on. We rather keep it clean, focus on that comparable set of contracts. Yes, I mean Eurozone. Well, these are regional bailout mechanisms, right? The ESM is a regional fund, so it would end up there. Sudden stop, well taken. Geostrategic interest, even more well taken. That's part of the expansion we're currently doing, coming from military alliances. Let me take a couple of sentences on China. That's really important. China is developing. To me, as a sovereign debt researcher, it's fascinating to see what China is doing. They're pushing the frontier in enforcement. They're pushing the frontier in innovative legal design of all this Belt and Road contract. There are several papers on the issue, and I think this is not going away, right? This will continue, and it deserves much more work. And China, indeed, is, as you say, lending a lot in its bloc, if you want, including Africa, and tying countries via this tool. So emerging powers have always used trade, military, and finance to expand, and China is doing just that, and we will see more of it. And the rise of China in the international financial system, I think, is one of the most under-researched part of our field. So yes, this is very well taken. And in fact, the whole China agenda spilled out of this paper exactly for the same kind of intuition you had. Thanks a lot for the super constructive comments. So splitting the paper yes or no is an eternal debate within our team of co-authors. So well taken. On the interconnectedness, I mean, you say it's misleading to only focus on official to official. Just to our defense, I mean, there's been a whole generation of papers, hundreds, only looking at private to private or private to official. So we are misleading, then all these other hundreds of researchers are also misleading. They didn't consider official lending and kind of just shoved it away. And I think this is. I agree with you that a more holistic view is definitely needed, especially in this whole risk-sharing literature, right? Which is all about disasters and shocks and all that, but it ignores basically everything not IMF. Right?
I would say prior to the 50s, it doesn't matter because it was only official to official, government to government, but at least after the 50s we have data, so they can simply add as a control.
We are at, there is no bilateral lending data set on financial, we are at it, we have a second short. And heterogeneity, sure, I mean, there can be like long-standing lending relationship that only kind of are reinforced in a crisis. to some degree you can control for it. I mean, the shocks per se are pretty exogenous, I would say. And we do control for, pre-shock trade levels. Trade levels are usually slow moving, so it's probably not the core, it won't, erode the entire story, but of course, there's better ways to control for it there. I certainly see better strategies also there. So, very well taken, and so I think I have 8 more minutes until to answer any Q&A. Happy to do that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I see 2 questions already. Maybe Julian, line first, and then Kerstin.
Thanks. A very short question, because you hinted at it. Is there then actually a other interrelationship between the private sector and the public sector? Because you said maybe there are powerful classes in the lending nations trying to preserve their own investment they had done privately before. Is there kind of more detail in your figures for that?
It's a fantastic data set. I love it. I really admire the data. We only have, or the ES only has part of it. 2 main comments. One on the purpose. So why do they lend? Especially for China, it's all about commodities. They have a lot of, China is lending a lot also to Latin America. It's not only about the Belt and Road Initiative. Latin America is super important for them, for rare earth, lithium, and etc. As far as the purpose is concerned, so let's say access to commodity markets, that's one issue. When you come to the central banks and the swap line, I would feel that's a completely different animal, because the swap lines, it's just, this debt is already there. It's just in a different currency, and then there's a swap with the currency, with the national bank of the currency, basically, in order to avoid a default. So I think that's already there. I would treat it differently. Then on the private versus official lender distinction, I think you have to be super careful, because from the emerging markets, for Chinese banks, also for Russian banks, the government ownership is super high. So even if in BIS data they show up as a bank, it's not a bank. It's really interrelated. So I think you have to be very careful when that comes up. And then coming back to the purpose to some extent, I think you really have to differentiate between these official organizations, because the purpose is local development, and that's different from, let's say, access to a market. In our paper, we also, what always stands out is this high correlation of that's bank lending and international trade, and that just everything else completely disappears beyond that. It's always this correlation which really drives these bilateral ties.
The question is, one more question before you can answer, or shall we collect all your questions and take them home?
Maybe one more, and then I can 3 minutes.
Okay.
I think this is an outstanding case that by presenting data, immediate questions come up of interpretation. So I think this idea that you present in the first volume the data and the next volume is reserved for interpretation, I think is a reasonable suggestion. So I would first say congratulations on your work. I would not have liked to be in your steps. You said 6 years, more or less, but this is what we need also in our profession. Data mining sometimes is seen as less important, but I think your case demonstrates it's badly needed. So I will, and immediate, at last, said, looking at the data raises immediate questions. So I will add only one. The IMF's role has increased, of course, was created in 44, so, but it has increased. And this is so far surprising that during the time of fixed exchange rates, the IMF role should have been much more important in lending. And with flexible exchange rates, there was a naive notion that then you don't need any more IMF support, because flexible exchange rate would do the job. And private lending and in combination with flexible exchange rates would make official support from the IMF superfluous. Why did this not happen? Just adding to the long list of wishes, one more.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So yes, IMF, I mean, we have a separate paper on the IMF, and one answer is that the role of the IMF evolved, right, from kind of classic payment crisis fighter to tackling that sustainability issues, right, and bank bailouts and all that. So they've moved from the original, purpose the institution was meant for, and evolved now. Whether that's good or bad, that's another issue. But you really see kind of the rise of the debt crisis of the 80s changed the lending amounts. You see, suddenly the IMF bailing out highly indebted countries, and that's what explained much of the shift to size, right? So that's one answer. But it's that's a very big question, not easily answerable. Yes, on the other, I think when you combine your two questions, I mean, the answer is granularity, right? So when you compare official and private, we need to move well taken one step further. We have all the micro data on official lending, we have granular data on the private flows as well, and one could even go maturity by maturity and look at what exactly happens when who are the lenders, what are the interest rates, the kind of subsidization effect on all that. So there's a lot to do with combining the two kind of data sets. Commodity lending well taken. This has been, entering foreign countries for commodity purposes, but also several other purposes, military and strategic, is an old story, very old story. So what the Chinese are doing is just a repeat of, in a way, also the Marshall Plan and what the Germans did in the Berlin backed-up railway, all these things.
The conditions are super tight, right? The conditions
of China. Yeah, although it was not fun to have land from Britain in the 19th century either, right? So again, they're not unique in history. Trade and finance well taken, and I think that there's a whole agenda that needs to be done on state ownership of banks. So I agree with you. We don't even have knowledge on what size of the official lending. Chinese banks are the biggest bank in the world by far, and they are venturing abroad, and they are all state-owned or state-controlled in some way or the other. So, and we're still working with our standard portfolio optimizing agents, which are not what China is doing. So we need to work much more on that.
So banking won't help for you to stay.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.